All right, welcome to another on the road open Twitter space debate. Today is the same as yesterday and the day before. Cross your fingers. Hopefully, the internet connection will stay steady. If you're listening to this later on YouTube and it sounds like I have a gay lisp, I do not. It's the audio compression from cell phone to Twitter and then into video format. I promise you, I do not have a gay lisp, nor do I fake gay lisp just because I'm on Twitter space.
Can you hear me all right? Or
Yeah, I'm well. We can hear you really good. What's up?
okay, so like was saying in the chat earlier, I think I understand the argument, and I'm honest. I'm not really on one side or the other. I'm kind of centrist in the whole thing. But is the point that's being made by the EO apologists that the Roman Catholics are saying, oh, the papacy provides unity, and look at all these schisms, but in the same time, they were still it kind of validates the first millennium church, but at the same time, post Vatican II and all this other stuff that we have, is the Sede Vacantis, we have the Palmarian Church, even though they're kind of
No,
like
no, no, no.
no,
Let me just make it really quick and simple and precise. The
yeah,
argument is that the problems that Ibarra or Voice of Reason lists as what are defeaters for orthodoxy. If the Roman Catholic Church is the church of the first millennium, then those same defeaters become defeaters for the Roman Catholic Church of the first millennium. That's the argument. Does that make sense or not?
yes, it does make sense. Yeah,
Okay, and do you, why I know that you don't necessarily agree with it, but
yeah.
why do you think that could you explain why it makes sense?
Well, honestly, I mean, I've been kind of researching both. I've been a Roman Catholic my whole life, but I've been researching Orthodoxy for probably like 3 years or so now. And I was like about ready to jump ship for a minute, and I was honestly because listening to your show. But then I read Russia and the Universal Church, and while I do believe that EOs are part of the one church, I believe that the papacy just provides a more normative means of unity. I mean, that's like I guess it's personal preference, but that's just kind of where I'm at right now. You know what I mean?
Okay, so a couple different issues here. First of all, uh, I've read Solovyov's book, so and I don't mean this in a condescending way. You're pretty much at the exact same point I was at in 2007 and 8, where I was trying to decide between, okay, I've been attending Antiochian liturgy, I've been going to some catechumen classes, I'm a trad cat. I'm just kind of not sure where I'm at between these two. And I read that book because I thought, maybe this would be a good kind of Eastern Catholic midway approach or something. I mean, I know Solovyov's not Eastern Catholic. He was writing about issues that he saw in the church in terms of, and one of the key arguments he makes, for example, is very similar to the argument that Voice of Reason and Ibarra make, which is that, well, you've got these different bishops and patriarchates that remove each other from being in communion.
Yeah.
And if you've got like a Bulgarian church out of communion with another church for about 100 years, then that seems to be a pretty strong defeater for the possibility of the Orthodox Church having unity. But that's another version of this very point that I'm making and that Ubi's making, which is that the problem is that that's very common in the first 1,000 years of Christianity.
Yeah.
And what we don't see is the Roman See actually being a solution to this. That's why it was really important
Ah, okay.
for
Yeah.
Ubi for Ubi to bring up the Meletian schism, because in the Meletian schism, if you read the letters of Basil, Basil says Rome actually made the problem worse in terms of Meletian schism and offered no help whatsoever. So the very examples that we would point to, I think, are defeaters for the first millennium church being the Roman Catholic Church. And it's a double-edged sword because it also shows this argument that Soloviev and Voice of Reason and Ibarra use would also defeat the first millennium church for being a Roman Catholic institution as well. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
So if I can rehash it back to you just to make sure I understand. So if the papacy was this figure of unity, then why didn't they do their jobs in the first millennium with all these schisms, et cetera, right?
That's one point that Basil's letters make. But separate
Got it.
from that, if the argument from Voice of Reason is let's say for the sake of argument that's the case, and political squabbles, jurisdictional squabbles, removal of one bishop from another in terms of communion, if those are defeaters for being the one true church, and if the Roman Catholic Church is the church of the first millennium, it has all of those same problems, and thus it becomes a defeater for the Roman Catholic Church in the first millennium as well.
Okay, got it. Okay. All
Now,
right.
that's one argument, that's one key point. But separate from that, if you look at what I posted today, this is a whole other topic. You'll notice that Ephesus grants autocephaly to the Church of Cyprus in Canon 8. The Roman Catholic Church doesn't have autocephalous churches. And so that right there is another kill shot proof that the Roman Catholic system post first millennium is not the same church in terms of its ecclesiology and ecclesial structure as the church in the first millennium.
Okay, got it. All right. Well, to push back a little bit, and it's not because I want to be conversational. It's because
That's fine.
I honestly do want to know what the
No, I welcome
position
it.
is.
You seem like a genuine, like inquiring person. That's fine. I welcome it.
Okay, so one of the examples, and I know this was kind of brought up in the debate a little bit by Voice of Reason. One of the examples in Russia in the Universal Church is that there was an Anglican bishop that was going to become EO, but the church, I believe it was Russia and Greece didn't agree on whether his baptism was valid. That seems like a big deal to me if you can't agree on if someone is even in the church to begin with. You know what I mean? Like I understand there's like nuances to which church you're
Yeah.
in, but that's like a red flag to me personally. You know what I mean?
Okay, so yeah, let's that's a good question. So let's deal with that because I remember too when I was like, I'd say around 2007 or 8, um, I had the assumption that you either have a Protestant position on sacraments or you have the Roman Catholic position of ex opere operato. And if you don't believe in ex opere operato, then you have Donatism. And the mistake that I believed at that time was that that's really the only options. The difference is that Orthodox ecclesiology is not the same thing as the Roman Catholic sacramentology and ecclesiology when it comes to ex opere operato. So we don't believe Donatism, and I'm just saying this to kind of get a couple things out of the way, and then I'll get to your example of the Anglican guy.
Got it.
Uh, we, so we don't believe that uh, you can mechanically maintain the power of sacraments if you're an apostate or if you lose the faith. And the Roman Catholic Church differs from us on this because they actually believe that you could be ordained to the priesthood. That same day, you can become a Satanist, you can leave the church, and you can still, for the rest of your life, confect a real, valid, grace filled Eucharist, for example.
Hmm.
For us, we think that's preposterous. We think it's insane. We also think it's preposterous and insane that, for example, a Muslim or an atheist can baptize people.
Yeah.
But that's the logic of the Roman Catholic adoption of ex opere operato as it develops into early and medieval theology, right? By the time of the 7th century, by the time of the middle, the Roman Catholic Latin Church has basically explicated a very strict view that what's necessary for the sacrament is matter, form, and intention. The weird part is, how can an atheist or a Muslim have the intention to do baptism? It doesn't seem to make any sense whatsoever, and yet that is the Roman Catholic official dogmatic position.
Yeah.
So notice that if you go the Roman Catholic route, it's not just avoiding Donatism. You're actually adopting an absurdist position that Satanists can confect the Eucharist and that atheists and Muslims can have the intention to do what the church
So
does.
it's not necessarily
Orthodoxy,
like personal
you go,
sin. It's more like being outside of the church.
well, the logic of the ex operato position eventually in the Roman system went further than just the question of the validity in, say, a sect or a schism. It went all the way into saying that an atheist and a Muslim can baptize. That's in
Yeah.
Denzinger. And the Orthodox would say if you've left the faith, that's no longer a sacrament. It's not valid and there's no grace.
Yeah.
There's a separate question when it comes to sects and groups that do the rituals correctly. And in that case, you might have a schismatic who has all the same theology. Like, say, for the Orthodox perspective, if we saw a Monophysite and the Monophysite, you know, Coptic or whoever, they wanted to come to the Orthodox Church, there's always been flexibility in the ancient canons as to how people can be received. So debate about different people's reception is actually normal and has always happened in the history of the church. Let me give you an example. If you look at the canons of the Sixth Council, it actually states that some sects and heretics, their baptisms are not considered at all able to be received. So, for example, it mentions the Unitarians. If you had a Unitarian modalist baptism, that is not a baptism, even if you use the right words, because the intention and the understanding was Unitarian. And so there's a canon in the Sixth Council that says we do not accept Unitarian baptism. But there's other cases where if a novationist, or if a Donatist, or if any of these groups that happen to also be Trinitarian did a baptism, we could receive the rite, although we would say as Orthodox that what's preventing the grace is actually is being in the heresy. So once they abjure the heresy, that can be accepted. So the fact that there was disagreement between Greeks and Russians about the reception of converts or the vesting of priests is again another thing that was pretty common in the ancient church. And if you look at the canons of St. Basil, for example, Basil just kind of says stuff like, well, over there they receive people in this way. We receive people with, abjuration of heresy and chrismation. It's okay. It's okay because we leave it up to the local level.
Mhm.
So I don't actually even think that's a kill shot unless you have the assumption that a lot of Roman Catholics do, which is that the only way to have the church is to have one single way of receiving converts. And so that's just simply foisting Roman Catholic ecclesiology onto Orthodoxy and saying, if you don't have this ecclesiology and way to receive converts in a unified way, then you can't be the true church. But the problem is that that same standard, again, also doesn't work in the Roman Catholic Church. For example, in the Roman Catholic system, there are three patriarchs of Antioch. Well, that's a violation of the ancient canons. And how do we know which one is the actual patriarch of Antioch? In that case, well, the Pope has actually said that all three are okay. Well, there's not supposed to be in the canons of the church three patriarchs of Antioch. There's only supposed to be one. So that is another element or example of quote division.
Mhm.
Likewise, the Roman Catholic Church allows the Eastern churches to not say the filioque, whereas in the Latin Rite they have to say the filioque. How is that? That's two different faiths and two different creeds. The ancient church decreed that there's only one creed for the church.
Yeah.
And yet the papacy allows two different creeds to be recited. And even in their Vatican clarification document, they admit that the theology is different between the East and the West. They admit that
Which document
even
was
though
that?
you can
Sorry.
find it's called the Vatican clarification on the
Okay,
filioque.
got it.
And if you read that whole document, it gets down to the bottom and it basically says, on the issue of double eternal hypostatic procession, we still do have a disagreement and a tension. So it still admits that the key issue is not quote resolved.
Got it.
Does that make sense? So in other words, you can't just say, well, the Roman See is allowing the uniates to not say the filioque, and the Latin Church has to say it, but we have the same understanding. When the Vatican clarification admits that, it's still not the same understanding.
Got it.
Likewise, for example, the Latin Church does not teach that you can participate in uncreated grace. It believes in created grace, and the Uniates believe in uncreated grace, like us. So there's an illusion of the same theology, the same faith, that which isn't actually on the ground. For example, the Melkite Catechism says there's 7 ecumenical councils. Well, that's not what the Roman Catholic Papal Church teaches, and yet the Melkite Catechism just says what we say is Orthodox, right?
Yeah.
So at every juncture, what appears to be a pretty solid sort of papal example of unity isn't actually a papal example of unity. And the last um, couple examples I'll give is in Unum Sanctum, you had to in the 1300s, you had to believe in the temporal supremacy of the Roman bishop to be saved, not just his spiritual supremacy, but his temporal supremacy. That doctrine is no longer confessed or mandatory after Vatican II because you have the decatholicization of Christian states and you have the loss of the papacy's temporal power. And yet in the 1300s, this was a doctrine necessary for salvation. So that is another change that shows that it's not the same church of the first millennium as it is the second millennium, and that it even changed and discarded this medieval doctrine that was necessary. Secondly, How has the papacy provided unity and clarity on something so fundamental as the death penalty when it was necessary and part of just natural law and natural justice in the Catechism of Trent? And by the time of Francis and John Paul II, it's quote against the gospel. When it comes to fundamental things like contraception, Roman Catholics claim to have this unified position, and yet they didn't have a statement on it until Humana Vitae and Pius XII statement, whichever document that was. So, well, now wait a minute. If unification on this is an indicator of the true church, then the Roman Church lacked it until they made this statement in Pius XII and in Paul VI Humana Vitae. So that would also be another defeater for the Roman Catholic position, you see. And then furthermore, um, in 1928, it was still considered an apostasy from the gospel to engage in interfaith gatherings and ecumenism. And
Yeah, that
after
one's a big one
Mortalia
for me.
Manor,
That's probably my
but
biggest red flag,
yeah,
honestly.
yeah, you get a couple decades later at Vatican II, and it's now the work of the Holy Spirit. So to me, these are indicators that although Rome, it's kind of like a car sales pitch, right? It's like I'll give you a good car. It's right here. Look how pretty it is. Look, it's a beautiful car, and yet it's like it doesn't have an engine, doesn't have a carburetor, doesn't actually do anything, but it looks like a pretty car. I mean, it's got all the appearance of a car, but it doesn't have the actual engine and workings of a car. It's not a unified working system. It just has the appearance of it under the banner of the Pope. And yet you've got the Latin Mass that's been suppressed. I mean, I used to go to the SSPX for like 8 years.
Mm,
And we thought that when Benedict was elected, he had all this, pro Latin Mass uh, verbiage that he was spouting. Oh, maybe we're finally going to get a movement towards, some rectification on this and that. But even if there had been a wide scale promotion of the Latin Mass, there still would have been all the issues of Vatican II and the documents of Vatican II, right?
yeah.
And there's never going to be you can't retract Vatican II. It's already been like dogmatized. It's already in the catechism. It's already been taught by the Roman See throughout the entire world. So there's no like going back. And we could try to say stuff like, well, maybe we can figure out a way to interpret, Vatican II to make it fit with Vatican I, or the pre Vatican II teachings. But I think if you read a book like the 10 books, the 16 papal documents book, it's pretty clear that you've got 2 or 3 centuries of papal teaching against ecumenism, against freedom of conscience, freedom of worship, freedom of religion, against a secularized state, um, on and on and on, syllabus of errors, quas primas, morari vos, lamentabili. I mean, all of these documents just hammer away at all the basic principles that Vatican II reverses and makes mandatory. So to me, Vatican II in the last 70 years of the papacy is the great worldwide testament to the fact that the papacy not only does it not provide unity, it actually is a hindrance to it.
Got it. So last kind of thing here is like I don't know if you could tell in my tone. Hopefully you can, but like I just want to go where is the truth, but at the same time, it's like, well, the way I see it is like, okay, the Roman Catholics have all these messed up problems. The EO has all these problems, and it's like, well, where do you even go? Like, I guess you just got to go
Well,
with your
that's why I keep
conscience.
no, no,
But
I keep saying like the it's the type of problem. Not
yeah,
every
yeah,
problem is a system level defeater. And that's why if you can show a dogmatic papal contradiction or a contradiction in the magisterium, that's a system level defeater. So for me, when I was, Tradcat and, then in 2007, 8, I started reading the exact same stuff you're talking about. I read Solovyev's book. I read, started reading Eastern Fathers. I read all the sort of normal stuff that people first encountered, Timothy Ware. I read, Peter Gilchrist. I read all these different positions. Then I went back and I read like, some of the oh, what's that guy's name? The Butler Dahlgren and Hess book on the papacy. So I was at exactly the point that you were at right now back at that time. And I remember getting really frustrated and I remember thinking, like this papal thing kind of goes back and forth. It's really difficult to reconcile it with all these different quote mines. And then I have to go
yeah.
actually read all the context of the quote mines. And I finally decided that the only way that I would actually be able to settle this issue would be, first of all, the theology. not just I mean, I understand that the papacy is part of the theology, but like theology proper in terms of like the Trinity and Christology. And on top of that, I decided that if there's a system level defeater, then that would defeat the system.
Yeah.
And even Ibarra said in our debate at the beginning of it at some point, he said something like, Jay, if you could show a papal contradiction in the magisterium, then yes, it would be a defeater for Catholicism. So I've always seen like these key, dogmatic contradictions as the defeaters. And I don't see those as defeaters, those same defeaters in the Orthodox system. So I think you have to judge these systems on their own paradigm and their own standards. Like you can't take a papal idea of what unity is and say, oh, look, Orthodoxy doesn't have the papal idea of
Yeah.
unity.
Yeah. Yeah.
Therefore, Orthodoxy, because we have a different conception of what the unity of the churches is. It's just like Ubi was arguing. It's the mindset of the authors of the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed. It's the Cappadocians' idea, right? That's what they were writing when they wrote that creed. We can't read back into it what Vatican I thinks that the idea of unity is, and then say, "Look, you didn't meet the standards of Vatican I's idea of unity." I mean, I don't mean to change the subject, but like you've seen the Chieti and Alexandria documents, right?
Yeah, I have, and that's kind of what made me kind of throw my hands up and be like, "Well, I mean, I guess we can't really tell them that they're not part of the church because we say they're part of the church, you know." So it's
Well, that right there would be an obvious
yeah, yeah,
flip flop on the part of the papacy. Like, why is the papacy just not saying what it said at Vatican I? Because Vatican I says in the anathemas, if you don't accept Vatican I's teaching, you're anathema.
yeah, yeah, and obviously that
Or
would apply
think
to
of it this
yeah,
way, like, why does the Roman Catholic Church no longer do anathemas when it used to?
yeah, yeah. That makes sense. Um,
But hey, man, I mean, those are great questions, and I really appreciate you actually coming and having the dialogue. I mean, feel free to bring up whatever topics you want otherwise too.
yeah, yeah. I'd like to just like kind of think on this a little bit, and my main focus, like, yeah, I understand like the ecclesiology is the foundation of everything, but myself, like you, I'm more interested in theology, so I kind of would
Well,
like to just.
I actually think the theology is more important than the ecclesiology. I believe that
Okay, gotcha.
ecclesiology actually stems from first, like in the Orthodox order of theology, the order of theology, it's Trinity, Christology, and then sacramentology and ecclesiology flow from those two.
Yeah, yeah,
And by the way, isn't it interesting that if the Vatican I idea of the church is the ideal indicator of the church, why did it take them 2,000 years to figure that out and define that? Wouldn't that have been one of the first things defined?
yeah, yeah. But I mean, at the same time, you know, faith is like a mustard seed. I mean, we don't get the whole thing all at once.
No,
I mean,
I
that's
disagree with that. That's the Newman model, and the Orthodox idea is the opposite. We would argue that every one of the fundamental essential components is in the apostolic deposit. There's nothing that was necessary that came about in the 7th century or the 5th century. Now you might say, well, but what about icons or what about, words like inhypostatize at the 5th council? We would just simply say that those terms are explicating and specifying ideas that were already there. That's why it's very important for us, for example, to say that the Trinity is not a New Testament doctrine.
yeah,
It's
yeah. I agree with you
it's
guys. The
the
stuff that you go
yeah.
with, like with Aiken and Horn and everything, it's like you guys are completely wrong on this. But
Well, the same principle applies, I think, in terms of the apostolic deposit too. Like the notion of some communion rail or some form of iconostasis was even there at the very beginning. It comes out of the Jewish temple and synagogue system. It's not something that was developed by the time of the Seventh Council. And this, I think, is a very bad argument that Ibarra makes because he gives the Protestants all this leverage, especially Gavin Ortland, when Ibarra says stuff like, "Oh, well, icons developed by the time of the Seventh Council. They weren't there in the early church." That's a Protestant argument.
yeah,
If you read the and by the way, it's a denial of the Seventh Council because the very first statements in the Seventh Ecumenical Council actually say we in line with the tradition of the fathers, uphold the apostolic tradition of iconography. So the Seventh Council actually argues that it's not a development, but that it was actually an apostolic tradition. And it's the same principle as relics and the Eucharist and the cross, which go back to the early centuries of the church, right? The principle is that it's an incarnational faith and that they were always there. Now, it's not the case that the catacomb church is necessarily going to have a giant ornate basilica because they're being persecuted, obviously, but the principles are still there. In fact, when I went to Rome, you can walk through the catacombs and you could see that the Christians drew imagery on the walls and over the altar and on the altar
Yeah. Yeah, I see what you're saying.
in the catacombs, which are like first, second, third century.
Yeah. All right, man. Well, cool. I'd like to call back in another time and kind of chop up the essence energies distinction too. I don't have time to go into
Absolutely, yeah.
so I'd love to
That's
talk.
actually my favorite topic. In fact, is that's the gender distinction. I think that was the uh, ultimate like thing that tipped me over towards orthodoxy.
Yeah, honestly, I just got finished with Palamas's triads, and it's pretty good.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's pretty
Hey,
good. So
that's great. You read that, yeah.
yeah. So all right, man. Cool. I appreciate your time. I look forward to talking to you again.
Absolutely, anytime, man. Anytime. Victor, what's up, dog? Notice that was a good faith inquiry there.
Can you hear me?
Hey, what's up?
Hey, I have two questions about Roman Catholicism that I kind of don't know how
Okay.
to process. First one is that when I read, I may not know the full history, and that's the main issue, but during the split between the Orientals and the Orthodox Church, I understand that uh, the Orthodox Church kind of put a patriarch in Alexandria to because the older one became a schismatic, and that's why we have a patriarch of Alexandria nowadays, which is Orthodox. But why isn't there like after the Pope defected? Why didn't the Orthodox Church kind of got a new Pope?
Well, first of all, the Orthodox Church didn't have the ability to go into that region and just do that, right? Because eventually, as the papacy grows in power, can you mute when I'm not? When it's echoing. Yeah, thanks. So, as the papacy grows in power due to the vacuum of the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, the papacy also ends up having a lot of geopolitical power. This is where you get the rise of the papal states, and so there's no way they were going to just allow some other bishop to come in and be set up. So that's one reason. And I would say that there's plenty of cases where there might be an Orthodox patriarch that was set up, and there's plenty of cases where the Orthodox churches wasn't able to set up a patriarchate. Um, Maybe in Egypt, for example, or where the Syriacs and the Coptics are, they might have eventually gotten Orthodox bishop there. And even today in Rome, there are Orthodox bishops in Rome. Um, for example, there's a Romanian bishop that's an Orthodox bishop in Rome, and there might be, I know there's an Orthodox bishop, like a Russian Orthodox bishop over Italy, and I would assume he has jurisdiction in Rome too, but he might be based in Florence because we've actually been to that church in Florence. So there's a giant Orthodox cathedral in Florence. But I can't remember if there's a Russian Orthodox church in Rome or not. There might be one. I'm not sure.
Oh, okay, I see. And how would apostolic succession would fit in this? Because from my understanding, it should have like if there were to be a new pope or an actual Orthodox pope, there would have been a need to follow the line of Saint Peter or whatever, or could it be like any consecrated by any other bishop?
No, yeah, no, that's a good question. I think if you look at this came up, I think yesterday, or the day before. If you look at the letter that Metropolitan Seraphim of Piraeus, who's a pretty prominent Greek Greek bishop, when Francis was elected, he wrote a pretty long letter to Francis outlining like the remaining problems with the Vatican. And I think that conceivably, for example, if Rome, he lists about 32 or 34, I can't remember how many it is, things that the Vatican would have to like get rid of before it could come quote back into communion with the Orthodox. But I think that there probably could be some situation where there is a recognition of some succession that's still there, even though we don't necessarily say that it has grace. There is still some succession, just like we could receive the Monophysites, perhaps without, they don't have to be rebaptized. There've been pretty consistent traditions where those kinds of groups can be received by vesting, or those kinds of groups can be received by abjuration of heresy. There's flexibility, and if you read the canons of Saint Basil, he's pretty flexible about this stuff. So conceivably, if Rome said, okay, I don't think this is going to happen, but let's say for the sake of argument, Rome said, okay, we agree to all, 34 errors that are listed in, the Byzantine lists or in Metropolitan Seraphims letter. How could we come back? There would probably be some sort of synodal decision about, you know, vesting or something like that.
Oh, okay. Now I got it. Thanks. And the other thing is, are there any specific council canons or anything that's more general to the church and not something by a specific jurisdiction about the non-validity of Roman Catholic sacraments? I read that the council in Trullo had one, but it had more to do with the actions of priests and bishops and not something to do mainly with like laity. Is there any canon about this specific one?
If you get the book that Father Here's put out called Catholicism, there's a lot of references and statements in that giant book, and it will refer to a lot of synods. You have synods like I think it's Confession of Disitheus. You have a statement that says that outside the Orthodox Church, without the permission of the bishop, there are no celebrations of the Eucharist. So, for example, that's one clear case where it's pretty obvious that we're not saying that they have gracious sacraments. And the reason I don't like the term valid is that it's ambiguous. Every time this debate comes up, everybody default. I'm not faulting you. I'm faulting just in general that people default to the Roman Catholic terminology because the term valid is ambiguous. It could be, for example, that the Orthodox Church looks at a monophysite baptism and says, "Okay, you did the ritual right, and so it doesn't have to be redone." And the thing that's preventing the grace is that you have the heresy, right? So if the heresy is removed, then the grace will no longer be prevented and becomes gracious when you abjure the heresy. Or they might determine, for example, in the case of there are some Novus Ordo churches in the Catholic world, for example, nowadays, who don't even do a Trinitarian baptism. They do. There have been cases where they baptize in the land, the sea, and the air, and I think the Orthodox Church would say that's not even a baptism. That's not even the ritual wasn't even done correctly. But I think it's pretty clear in the Orthodox tradition that we never just default to saying you had grace because you did the ritual right, because that would mean that we're affirming that you can have the sacraments outside of the faith, and we don't say that. If you leave the faith, you don't have the sacraments. Even if you do the ritual right, and even the church says, okay, we don't have to redo the ritual because when you abjure the heresy, then the grace is efficacious. You see, so I think it's better to frame it like gracious sacraments rather than quote valid or not, because even the Roman Catholic position, even when they admit that there's grace and sacraments quote outside the church, even that position, like if you read Augustine still believes that even though it's valid and gracious, if it's done in heresy, it doesn't do you any good. So it's like you have to remove the thing that's the impediment to the grace, which is the sin of heresy, before it's like efficacious, even in the Augustinian view.
Oh, okay. Cool. Now I can understand it better. I remember
And
you.
again, and again, and again, remember in the Roman Catholic system too, it's not just the Augustinian debate of ex opere operato or Donatism. It's more precise than that because by the 7th, 8th, and 9th century, the Roman Catholic Church begins to define that what's necessary for the celebration of the sacrament is matter, form, and intention. And that means that anywhere that the sacrament is performed, even if you get ordained in the Roman Catholic priesthood and become a Satanist that day, you can still, for the rest of your life, confect a gracious, valid sacrament of the Eucharist, which we think is crazy. This is why, for example, if I can read Athanasius's festal letters, and if I don't say who it is, Roman Catholics will hear it and say that it's Donatist, because Athanasius says that there is no celebration of the Pascha outside the church. And if I say, well, there is no celebration of the Eucharist outside the church, Roman Catholic, oh, you're a Donatist. That's not what Donatism is. It's more precise than that. Donatism is the belief that the personal sins of the minister can invalidate the grace of the sacrament. Like if your priest is thinking a dirty thought, when he baptizes you, or if your priest is secretly a heretic when he baptizes you, then your baptism is invalid. That's Donatism. That's not the same thing as saying that if you leave the faith and become an apostate, you can still do the sacraments of the church with grace. That's, we think, is crazy. And by the way, it's dogma in Roman Catholicism that Muslims and atheists can baptize you. We think that's crazy.
Yeah, it is crazy. Following that line
But
about
but
the
but but people don't realize, and they don't point this out when they try to get a gotcha on us when they say to us Orthodox, you have different ways of receiving converts. You can't agree, so you're not the true church. Ha ha ha! You're Donatist. It's like, well, wait a minute. Are you even aware of what the Roman Catholic position is? That matter, form, and intention allows an atheist to baptize and to do what the church intends? That's crazy. How can an atheist intend to baptize a person with the faith of the church? He doesn't have faith.
Yeah, I truly don't understand. But following that line about the matter, form, and intention, and the whole ordeal, I remember you talked about a case where a Roman Catholic priest was baptizing people, like saying like we.
Yes, this was in Arizona. This was in Arizona recently, and they said that because he pronounced the words wrong, the last 30 years of baptisms in Arizona were invalid, so nobody was baptized. So you see how the irony is that the Roman Catholic position is actually the rigorous position, and the economia position of Orthodoxy is actually the lax position,
Yeah, I remember he said something like we baptize, and the bishop discovered it, and it was like a whole thing. What
right?
would happen if like for example an Orthodox priest was doing it incorrectly and no one corrected him, and for the last 30 years or whatever he was like
Yeah, we know
baptizing?
we don't have that legal. That's why we don't have that's what I'm saying. We don't have the legalistic attitude that if you mispronounce a pronoun in the form of baptism, that suddenly everything is fake, and it's all fake and gay and nothing ever happened. But this is the legalistic Roman Catholic attitude of sacramentology that begins in Augustine's ex opere operato doctrine and develops into 7th, 8th century to where they say, I'm going from memory here in Denzinger. I think it's during the Carolingian period where you have the first statement around the 700s or 800s that in the West they say you can baptize, that an atheist or a Muslim can baptize. And then it develops into explicit statements in the Middle Ages that what's the essence of a sacrament? And it's matter, form, and intention. Every Roman Catholic catechism says this, by the way. It's not controversial. And so matter, right, being what you're using in the sacrament, the water or whatever, form being the words of consecration in the case of the Eucharist, and intention to do what the church intends to do in the sacrament. How does an atheist intend to do what the church does? It just makes no sense. But that's literally dogma in Roman Catholicism, and they just simply think that there's only two positions here. You're either a Donatist or you believe in Augustine's anti-Donatist position of ex opere operato. That's the only options here. When the Orthodox position is more nuanced than that.
Yeah, okay, now I understand it. Thank you. That was it. Thank you.
No, those are great questions, and everybody's been really cool.